I think if we can really be people that think about formation over information, hope over shame, practice over theory, community over individual, and being a reconciling community, and think about peacemaking over partisanship, I think this is ways that kind of help us to do the long marathon work for transformation.
Hi, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. Any of you who have been listening to this podcast for a while might remember today's guest, David Bailey. David is the founder and chief vision officer of Arrabon. And according to their website, Arrabon is a nonprofit ministry that cultivates Christian communities to pursue healing and reconciliation in a racially divided world. I'm not going to get into all the details right here because David and I get to speak about what it means to pursue healing and reconciliation in a racially divided world. And we're also going to talk about that word cultivate. What does it mean to cultivate a Christian community and a healing community? I reached out to David specifically in the wake of Tyre Nichols' death in Memphis because I didn't want to just react to a news story. I also didn't want to not react to a news story that points to some of the horrible history and present reality that we still have in a racially broken society. And I knew that David might be able to help me think and pray and live and love and hope in the midst of this broken world we live in. And I'm really grateful I did reach out because David is great at pointing me back to the long, deep, painful, and ultimately hopeful work of healing love in a world that is often filled instead with pain and shame and grief and despair. So I think you'll really appreciate his wisdom and perspective. I know I did as we talked today. One more note before we get to this week's episode. The season in the church year, the liturgical year, the season of Lent is coming up in just a few weeks. And I want to let you know I do have a few resources specifically for that season on my website. The first is a devotional guide through Lent, which you can order and just read day by day on your own or in groups. There also are questions for reflection at the end of each week. The second is a Bible discussion series, and that will lead you through my book, To Be Made Well, over the course of 8 weeks. So each week includes a short video teaching from me, as well as a passage for discussion from the Bible, questions for conversation, and then a 5-minute daily practice for the following week. You can look at both of these resources at amyjuliabecker.com/resources, or just look for a link in the show notes. And now for today's conversation with David Bailey. I'm joined by my friend David Bailey here today. David, thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, so glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me again.
Well, as longtime listeners of this podcast will know, you have been here a number of times before. In fact, I think you are my most frequent guest.
Man, that's a great honor.
It's really fun always to talk to you. Fun is maybe the right word, or maybe the right word is just I'm always, it's not just like information. It's like I'm always learning things, but also deepening and growing. And I'm sure that's true for people who listen along because our conversations are also some of the most listened to. So I know people listen to what you have to say and pass that along to other people. And I'm really grateful for that. So I thought I'd start, some people might remember this, but it's always good to be refreshed. You're the founder of Arrabon. And I just thought, well, I'll read a little bit from the website. Arrabon exists to creatively pursue racial healing in church communities. But I'd love for you to give us the longer definition, like the longer explanation of just what Arrabon is and the type of work that you do.
Yeah, so like the way we say it is like the problem that we're trying to solve is the inability of American churches to address racial brokenness in their communities. And we talk about like people's communities because like all problems are local. And so like we can't just deal with racial healing, racial reconciliation, racial justice, whatever term you want to use, like in the abstract. Yeah. It comes down to like, you know, your place of worship. It comes down to your place of work, your kid's school, your neighborhood, the community organizations that you're a part of. And so what we endeavor to do is to like work with people of faith to say, hey, how do we break something like this big concept and this big like problem that was centuries in the making and actually get it like really practical to what are some like faithful things that we could do to respond to be an agent of change. And so, you know, what we are is we're a spiritual formation ministry that equips the American church to actively and creatively pursue racial healing in their communities. And so, like I said, we say their communities, like your communities, because all problems are local. We say actively because a lot of times people are reactive versus being proactive. And we just believe that Christian communities ought to be proactive and creatively, because we're oftentimes presented with these false binaries. And we see whenever Jesus was presented with these like false binaries, he would oftentimes find a third way that was a creative kingdom way that would implicate everybody and allow people to love God and love their neighbor better. And so that's the kind of work that we do. And as practical as we endeavor and organize ourselves to be, we know all of this happens through spiritual formation. Like this is a spiritual challenge that has very practical implications.
And I think that's why I like keep getting drawn back into this conversation with you specifically, is because of that framing that that this is a work of spiritual formation, not just a work that is in the spiritual realm, although there's a truth to that, but that it's about the way in which we are formed, not just individually, but as a people. And then also, as you said, like the local, insisting on talking about communities and talking about local issues. And I'm thinking about the way in which we get news events that have to do with racial brokenness. And as you know, one of the reasons I reached out is in the wake of the death of Tyre Nichols, which is not a local event for me and obviously for many Americans, in the sense that I see this on the news and it's a horrible story again of a Black man being beaten and dying at the hands of police unjustly, right? And yet I feel as though I want to respond in some way, but I also know that this is a reaction on my part, and he is far away and his family's far away, and I can pray for them and I can care, but what can it like at the same time, something like that, a real visceral example of injustice, I want that to be something that is not simply prompting reactivity in me, right? But that's actually inviting me into like a deeper understanding and responsiveness to God's desire for justice in the world and for healing. So I just wanted to ask you how you think about whether it's Tyre Nichols' death in particular, or kind of these, what feels like constant news events that create these reactions. How do we think about that? How do we learn from these things? I don't know. Respond.
Yeah, well, start off by just saying, you know, it's a terrible, it's a terrible situation. I mean, like, I think that's just one thing. And when we deal with tragedy, our brains work to try to make sense of it. To be like, hey, how in the world can this happen? What's happening? What's going on? You know, and I think that's a very human thing for us to do. I remember Deacon Wilson, who was one of the wisest men I know. He had to drop out of school when he was in 8th grade to work on a family farm, but I just got so much wisdom from him. And one of the things he would always tell me, I remember being in college and just remember how profound he was. And he said, David, bad news always travels faster than good news. And so, our news cycles are, it tends to be bad news. It's like traveling faster than good news, and stoking fear and anger, because those are the things that can get this visceral reaction. And, again, like when you see 4 or 5 officers, beat a man to death, anger, grief. I mean, these are just shame. I mean, these are all reasonable human responses. But there's just kind of like this also, there's just kind of like almost like a shock information type of way to kind of like mobilize us around these particular issues of race. And, I would even say, particularly as a person who's like spent, really now like a decade and a half, just dedicated working on this work. There are issues around policing, but even when you get to the issues of policing, that's more of a symptom of the problem than the bigger problem itself.
Yeah.
Where you look at where these incidences happen, this is part of a significantly broken ecology that it is creating. Like you look at the biggest civil rights issue going on right now is public education. Like your zip code determines the quality of your opportunities or the unique challenges that you have. Like your zip code determines whether or not you get college recruiters or if you get military recruiters.
Yeah.
And this is something we all know. So folks like us who have options about where we live, we choose a zip code that has a great school.
Yeah.
And then what about those who can't choose a zip code that has a great school? Even if it's in the same county or even if it's the same city, there's certain zip codes that are better than others. And, the ones that have a lot of resources continue to have the resources because the education and economics is oftentimes tied to the tax base of the housing. And so this is like a systemically unjust situation, both in urban communities and rural communities.
Yeah.
And so this is a thing. And poor neighborhoods tend to be, tend to have, crime and things of that nature that happen within these spaces, particularly like particular urban areas. But then also it's true, there tends to be a lot of domestic things that happen in the rural communities. But these are just realities that is part of the brokenness of the world that we're in. And I think it's important that we don't only deal with it from like a news headline perspective, because a news headline doesn't articulate the depth of the problem. And I think if we could kind of see what's going on in this situation. And then once you deal with education, then you get with once you're actually in the criminal justice system, you could be poor. Like people who are poor get less justice than those who have more money and resources. That's not a arguable set of facts. And then when you add race on top of that, that compounds to another. So it's education, economics, and race are just profoundly broken situations that this is true no matter what community that you're in the United States. This is things that, we could try to do our best to do a little something about that. We underestimate what we can do, and through social media, through a conversation, or even over a year. But what if we said, hey, I'm going to try to do this one thing faithfully over the next 10 years to chip away at this. Those are the type of things that we want to look at, so we're not just doing that kind of shock jock reaction news cycle, bad news trend.
Yeah, I think, even from, as you know, I've been thinking and working and on the periphery of this space, I would say, for a long time also. And even there, I still feel the instinct to react quickly when there's a news story, even though I have done some of the reading and work to, as you were just saying, learn about the justice system and the education system. And I think part of that is because those things still feel so big and overwhelming. And so that immediate news cycle, even though it's also big and overwhelming, it feels a little more contained too, because it's one thing that happened in one place at one time, rather than, oh my gosh, there are millions of kids who are not getting what they deserve when it comes to a classroom setting, right? So I wonder whether you have any thoughts for people who are just feeling overwhelmed by the problem or kind of distant from it, even if they have some of that intellectual understanding.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was hosting my friend Jamar Tisby in a city event where we read Color Compromise last year. Every year, there's a pastor in Richmond that pastors a church right on Monument Avenue, historically white First Baptist of Richmond. And so we always challenge the city. We do an article in the paper, op-ed piece in the Richmond Times Dispatch, and then invite people to read a book in February, and then we'll discuss the book in either last week of February, first week of March. And we did Color Compromise last year, and Jamar is a historian, and somebody asked him the question. It says like, hey, like I just feel like 2020, I was like out doing a protest and doing like all of the things, and I just feel like I just like lost my zeal, and I just like am not like, what am I doing for racial healing? And Jamar really, from a historian perspective, is like, if we only judge if progress is happening with kind of racial justice healing by protest and by like kind of these kind of catalytic events, then we'll never feel like things are actually moving forward. I think about NAACP was started in 1908, and it wasn't until between 1908 or 1906, and it wasn't until 1954 they had Brown versus Board of Education, like that actually came through. So it was almost, literally almost like 45, 50 years before. It's still like 1960. It was basically like, almost 45 years before they had a significant amount of like legislation that changed. Yeah. You think about, folks were working on quote unquote civil rights issues from the turn of the century, but it wasn't until like the 40s when the black officers came back from World War II, and they just said like, hey, we were respected in Europe, we fought for our country, and they just couldn't take things laying down like they had to pre-going to the war, which then set up for what happened in 54. But then it was really like Emmett Till, which my dad's generation, he was probably about, my dad and uncle probably about 7, 8, 9, somewhere around there. And then seeing Emmett Till did that, then that a few years later set up for the Freedom Riders and all of those. Like, these were young kids. They were like 16, 17, 18, 19 years old when they were doing these sit-ins. And there's just like long view way of like really understanding the work that has that was needed to be done. And so here we sit, really 50, 60 years from a corrective move, but we're dealing with a problem that was centuries in the making.
Right.
And so if we could try to have that type of like understanding of the depth of the problem, then we could also say like, hey, what if we dedicate ourselves to be particularly like cultivate this aspect of the garden to try to bring some healing, and I like to use the metaphor of cultivation versus even the like metaphors of like production, because a lot of times like the scriptures use a lot of metaphor of cultivation, because I think both the spiritual life and the kind of reconciling human life of brokenness, like it takes time, it takes cultivation, it takes like breaking hard ground, watering, sowing, and just trying to trust in God to bring the increase, versus kind of an like mechanistic, production oriented type of society where we expect if we build the right system, that things should change immediately and we should get X amount of widgets or the desired results. And then now, like in this kind of internet age, it's even faster than that, right? Our expectations are even faster than that. But no matter how fast our computers can go, how fast AI can happen, humans move at a certain kind of pace that's really more agrarian when it comes to time is concerned.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so many things you just said that I want to respond to. One is just to let listeners know that Jamar is our second favorite guest on this podcast after you.
Oh, that's good. I will let him know that.
But I do have a conversation with him about The Color of Compromise and about his other books as well. So we'll put those in the show notes. But I also want to think about that cultivation versus production, which, again, something that I think about a lot is the speed with which our society moves. And I think about this a lot as it pertains to disability in terms of how we try to just be productive, enterprising, humans rather than people who are in relationships of compassion and really moving slowly through the world. But I also think about, there's a book called Reconciling All Things that you might know, out of the Duke Center for Reconciliation. And
Chris Rice and Cultivate. Yeah, I got it right there.
Yeah. And what I love is at the end of that book, and I'm sure you know this, but for listeners' sake, like they talk about the what we want with the work of reconciliation is for it to be quick, global, and innocent, when it is actually slow, local, and messy. And that comes up for me every time, again, one of these news events pops up, because it seems as though I could have like a quick, global, innocent response, right? Like there's just one right way to see this and to respond and then I'm done, right? Then I can just move on to my like normal life, as opposed to no, like in what ways is your own community hurting or broken that in some ways has been sparked by this shock jock thing that happened in the news, that is also horrible. And yet you really can't do anything about that. But what is the local impact? And know that it's messy. Know that you will not respond to it perfectly. Know that there will be days where you are selfish or tired or not paying attention or whatever it is, or that you say the wrong thing or you do the wrong thing, and that it'll be slow, that it will. I mean, I love what you were just saying about the way we need to understand time so differently. And there's a patience to that that's not the same as apathy. I was talking actually with my daughter about kind of a related thing in terms of the difference between generations and lifetimes, that if you think of kind of the longest that a human life can be is about 100 years. And so we are less than 2 lifetimes away from the centuries of enslavement. Like that's not very long. And it feels like it's long ago because we can say, well, it was 200 years ago, but it wasn't even 200 years ago. And, and it's actually only been half a lifetime, to your point, since we had the, I Have a Dream speech and the civil rights movement of the 60s. And so, wow, here we go. So I don't know. I think that it's just really important to push on that concept of time and remind ourselves that on the one hand, that doesn't invite apathy, like nothing, things just change so slowly and that's, we're making progress and let's pat ourselves on the back. But it also can help us to settle into, that idea of a long obedience in the same direction of just continuing to be faithful in our local communities, day after day after day.
Yeah, I mean, just to double click on what you're saying. I mean, Steve Harvey, his grandfather was an enslaved person, and it's really profound to when you think about that, like that it's not that long ago. And then I think some of what, and I even think like, I mean, as profound as slavery was, we would have probably made a ton more progress if we actually like repented from slavery. But, as Brian Stevenson says, slavery didn't end, it evolved, and really when you think about what happened after slavery was our country was organized so that if I had a black son and, you have a white daughter, that they wouldn't grow up next to each other and fall in love, get married and have mixed race children. Like I wish that was like something other than that the case. But you think about home ownership, that's the number one way to build wealth. And so, there's reason why they're all white communities, and those all white communities that stayed historically all white are going to be the wealthier communities. There's reasons why those are going to be more single family homes, houses. And then when, you go to the more blacker or more immigrant communities, they're going to have more apartments. They're going to be more like not as well kept the streets and things that the city is just not going to put as much resources. The schools are going to be in there, and that's the answer to wealth, like that's happened in our country, right? And then this is all post slavery, and then when it comes to jobs and income, our the way our country organized employment policies and wages are going up really up until kind of it became illegal in 1968, but it didn't really get into force until the 70s and 80s.
Right.
And this was about making sure that there weren't black people that were supervising white people. Mm-hmm. And so, that's where our country was organized around up until literally 30, 40 years ago, right? Like, and those are, and it has a lot of explanation for the way things have engaged. And so that's one of the things I kind of like about your book about healing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because for us, we really like to, like the phrase racial reconciliation, it's like loaded, has a lot of interpretation. It can be kind of challenging. The word racial justice sometimes could mean justice without reconciliation. What we really like to talk about is kind of healing. Like we talk about being a reconciling community, but a reconciling community is working towards like racial healing, right? Yeah. And engaging the word of healing. Because I think healing includes reconciliation, includes justice, and includes the like long work that it's like you have to do the like therapeutic work or the exercises, the things that happen, and then you got to allow God to do the work that allows the healing. But like when you've broken a leg or twisted an ankle or disrupted a muscle of some sort, like you just got to do the physical therapy, right? You have to just do the processes, and then like the body is designed to heal itself, but you just got to do the thing to kind of work with the body, right? And that is true of both the body of Christ and just the broader human shared humanity that we have that as image bearers, that if we do the exercises, if we do the work, then God allows us to for the body, for humans to engage with the healing that needs to take place.
Well, and that goes back to the kind of cultivation as well, just in the sense of it taking time. That like healing is even when we have kind of miraculous examples of what seems like immediate healings in the Bible, so much of what that is the beginning of a healing work for Jesus to reintegrate someone into a community. And I think that sense of, if we think about any injury in our body, I mean, even just a cut on our skin takes days to actually heal, much less something that's a deeper wound. And of course, we're talking on this kind of psychic and historic level about incredibly deep wounds that really do also, I've always thought about, like, if I were to, punch someone in the face and split my hand open, where I'm the one who's done the wrong and the offense is against the other person, and yet I've also harmed myself in the process. And so there's healing that's needed, on both sides, not because I haven't been in the wrong, but there's still healing that has to happen within me in order for me to be restored. And some of that healing, of course, is I'm sorry for punching you in the face, right? But some of that is like my hand needs to get better. So yeah, there's a lot of healing work. And I love just what you said in terms of the healing, including reconciliation and including justice, but being almost a broader work that, especially for people who believe in the healing work of God in our midst, is something that we really can commit ourselves to, in community. I wanted to go back a little bit. I also was just thinking, when you were talking about the difference between cultivation and production, about our kind of social media moment and how it is so easy to, like, reactivity, which is another thing you were talking about, to news events, right, is something that can look very productive. Like I'm immediately reacting, really, but I'm saying something, I'm making sure to draw attention to this issue, or I'm, having the quotation or the caption. And not that those are necessarily bad things. And yet there is that like sense of, it can also be a way to avoid the longer work of cultivating relationships, cultivating understanding. One of the things that I know I mentioned this to you in a different conversation, but I've really been thinking about recently is the difference between, so when it comes to issues around racial brokenness and racial healing, I feel sometimes a tension between speaking up and staying silent in order to not center my own voice, right? Like to know that I, as like the educated white woman, also have a lot to learn. And so I've been thinking about the idea of like active listening, of being engaged as a listener rather than simply passively staying silent, that there's a difference between like passive silence and active listening, although in both cases it might mean that I'm not saying too much. And I wonder just what you would say again to that sense of like, how do we cultivate responses that are more in that posture of patience, cultivation, longer, broader work rather than reactivity?
Yeah. So, we talk at kind of like Arrabon just about like how we are really trying to help the American church, Christians in America, to address racial brokenness in their communities. And we oftentimes like we see that there are like these contributing causes that like prevent us from being able to address racial brokenness in really helpful ways, and it tend to be these like misplaced emphasis. And so, one is an emphasis on shame over hope. Like a lot of times, people who are like passionate about issues of race, they use shame as a motivator instead of hope. Mm-hmm. And you might get a reaction to people when you use shame as a motivator, but the challenge of it is that like that's a short-term motivation. Like you get if you really want to change people from a deep down inside, you can say, hey, you can be better and you could do better, right? Like we can do this, There tends to also be an emphasis on information over formation. Like if you know better, then you'll do better. But that's not the way that we work, right? Like so in 2020, the way we responded was to read a bunch of stuff. And I'm not saying that like reading is a bad thing. I mean, I actually think it's helpful to being like informed, but to really understand that we've been malformed, like, and we need to be reformed. We need to be spiritually formed in a way that kind of helps us to be agents of healing. But to even just to understand how have we been malformed in the areas of race, and like, what does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be black? But it's not just about the information, but it's really about like how our formation, what is happening, and how can we be image bearers, like, and like live into this fullness of an image bearer, but then also create an atmosphere where other people can bear the image of God and engage in a really more helpful, harmonic way that we ought to be, a flourishing way to bring God's shalom to the world. But then there's emphasis on theory over practice. So you hear like terms like anti-racism or white fragility. These are all terms that were created in the academy.
Yeah.
These weren't terms that were created in the context of community and actually trying to do the work. It was like an abstraction trying to think about, okay, what's going on? How do we do this? We figure this out. And when you actually do things in practice, when your theory actually is in the context of practice, you're able to kind of be a lot more practical in the work that you're doing. There's like an emphasis on the individual over the community. And so the question is like, hey, I'm either like, I'm not being racist or those people are being racist. But we don't elevate the conversation to realize that like people form communities and communities form people. So when you're trying to be a reconciling community, like your Christian community ought to be saying, hey, how are we forming people into being a reconciling community? So no matter what topic comes up, what if it's race or gender or politics, like we're actually engaging in being a practice of being a reconciling community. And then the last was the emphasis on partisanship over peacemaking. There's more political discipleship going on right now than biblical discipleship, and that's a huge problem, right? Like we ought to be people that are engaging into some type of like forming where like Jesus says like, blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God. Mm-hmm. And so like being a child of God, like that's an identifying marker. And so like if you say like, hey, those are people being peacemakers over there, they must be children of God. Or another way of saying it is, these are people that are culture warriors. Are they really children of God?
Right. Right. If what they're known for is the way they fight.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that we should cause us to pause, right?
Yeah.
And so I think if we can really be people that think about formation over information, hope over shame, practice over theory, community over individual, and being a reconciling community, and think about peacemaking over partisanship, I think this is ways that kind of help us to do the long marathon work for transformation.
I love those, and I will just point people towards your website, which is Arrabon.com, because those are listed on the homepage, and I think it's probably would be helpful to spend time just contemplating all of them. But I wondered if you'd say a little bit more on the formation part. Like, what does that look like in communities to actually be attending to spiritual formation over information, which again, not to say that information is bad, but to really say, but the deeper emphasis is on the formation of us and of who we are as a community and who we are in that spiritual sense.
Yeah. So for us at Arrabon, I'll tell you like a practical thing that we do. So one of the like really practical things that we do is, we have, like, when we start off a course, we do this thing called Disciple for Complicated Emotions. And when you do any issues of race, class, and culture, it brings up emotions of fear, anger, grief, and shame. Mm-hmm. Like, no matter what you're talking about, no matter where you sit into this scenario, fear, anger, grief, and shame are the things that come up. So what I found is that when people, when communities things tend to fall apart, it happens because they were unable to deal with fear, anger, grief, and shame within themselves, or how to respond to somebody in a healthy way to engage in a response to kind of help move the conversation along. Like, things tend to fall apart, like when those kind of deep visceral emotions are happening. And so it's important that we grow both our emotional and our spiritual bandwidth to be able to do this work. Mm-hmm. And so we have this course that, we offer online and in person in communities called Discipling for Complicated Emotions. And when you can actually like sit into the hard and difficult things, that actually helps to have the emotional and spiritual bandwidth to do the marathon work. It's like stretching before going on a long distance run. Like, if you just take off and start running, you're going to get a neck cramp. You're going to have an injury. Yeah. And that's what happens. Then the second thing we do is a foundation for it.
Or you're going to stop running.
Yeah, for sure.
You might stop running because you get hurt, or you might just be like, I can't do this. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, that's great. No, I mean, that's exactly what happens, right? And I think a lot of people will stop running because they haven't done that stretch, Yeah. They haven't done that work. The second thing is foundations of reconciling community, and we talk about like this, the foundation of this. We basically have this image of a house, and imagine like at the foundation is reconciliation and spiritual formation. And so what that means is like we love Ruth Haley Barton's definition that spiritual formation is the process of being transformed into the image of Christ for the glory of God, the sake of others, and the abundant life. Spiritual formation is a process of being transformed into the image of Christ for the glory of God, for the sake of others, and for the abundant life. Well, when you just switch out the word spiritual formation for reconciliation is a process of being transformed into the image of Christ for the glory of God, for the sake of others, and for the abundant life. And you think about one of the most intimate relationships one can have is the covenant of marriage, right? Like there's a richness that happens when couples work through the process of reconciliation, right? Yeah. Like, and that is, if marriage is anything, it's cultivating love through reconciliation. And so and you, out of that, spiritual formation and transformation happens. And so in our communities, if we don't have that as a basic foundation, and then we try to insert something like race, which is this like century-old problem, we don't have the tools to to really engage in a really like healthy way. So then the second thing is this pillar of cultural intelligence. Like we could just talk past one another. Kind of similar again back to the like marriage metaphors, like family of origin, like ways of doing things that you just grow up that was just normal to you. It's just sometimes when we talk past one another, we need to like realize, okay, you know, we might be talking past another, not because we don't like the other person or because we're not committed to practice reconciliation, just because we're just from different cultural contexts and we need to like learn how to find some shared knowledge and language. The third step or the second pillar is understand historical context. You know, we say like you could use history to hurt people. Say, hey, you know, because of your past, you're not going to be more than what you've been in your past. Mm-hmm. You can use history to hide, where we kind of like tell a version of ourselves that like downplays the bad stuff and overemphasizes the good stuff. Mm-hmm. You use history to hide in that way, or you can use history to heal. Right? Like if you go to the doctor, say, hey, what's your medical history? You go to the therapist. What's your history? You know, when you go to that exercise specialist to lose that New Year's resolution weight, you say, "Hey, what's your exercise history?" Right? Yeah. And so, history is a tool that we're here today because for what happened yesterday. So, history can be used as a tool of healing, and so it's important for us to use history as a tool of healing. And then, you know, we got to practically work together. Like that's the third pillar in this house. You work together and you work cross-culturally, right? And that's where things actually get to put to practice. And then what we have like over our roof is creating new culture. We're here today because the culture was made yesterday. If we want to see something different tomorrow, we got to create new culture today. And that's how we move forward, right? And if we can put together a like an ecology of reconciliation, spiritual formation, cultural intelligence, working through like understanding our historical context, working together cross culturally and creating a new culture, and we just do this in our community faithfully over decades, we will see tremendous amount of transformation.
And what I'm really struck by, back to the concept of healing and some of the key distinctives you were mentioning earlier, is how much individual healing and community healing will be hand in hand. That there's a sense of, if and as, I think one of the things you originally said was we need to be kind of understanding how to emotionally and spiritually grow. Like that's part of the work of reconciliation. And obviously beginning with discipling these 4 complicated emotions, right? Like having to learn how to deal with grief and shame and fear and anger. Is that the last one?
Fear. Yeah, got it. Yep.
Okay. But there's a sense in which we need to learn how to do that historically, communally, but also individually, and that healing is going to be happening on all of those levels. And I wanted to ask about that relationship between the individual and the community, because we obviously in America live in such an individualistic culture, and we're so shaped and formed by the idea of being an independent individual who can take care of ourselves, which is not actually what happens, but it's how we think about ourselves and we think we're supposed to be. And yet it's certainly not the image from Scripture of what it means to be the people of God, what it means to be, human, what it means to be the body of Christ, any of these things. And even just on a, less Christian level, the functional way in which we operate as humans is in relationship with one another and in relationships of interdependence. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how we make the move as much in our own minds as in our actual experience, but from individual to community. Like you've said some of it, obviously the working together, but are there any other things you would add as far as making that shift?
Yeah, I mean, at Arrabon, everything that we do and everything that we create is to do it with people. Part of, Amy Julia, I've talked about me writing a book, and I've been working on writing a book and been writing chapters, but I've been hesitant to do that until there were these communal resources that we've been creating. I've spent energy over the last 15 years and really trying to create these communal learning experiences, these communal exercises to be able to help people to have imagination with their community. So one of the biggest things that I would, we encourage people to do is to do like Disciple for Complicated Emotions together with your community.
Yeah.
To do the study series together. And all our study series really help people to not just like know things, but to learn things, but then to like, and have conversations with people, but have a new imagination for what's possible in their community. And I think that's one of the biggest things to do, because we like, we click on Amazon, get a book, learn more information, share about what we learned, but not actually like, hey, what would it look like for us to kind of covenant to journey together? Yeah. And to grow and do something together.
Yeah, it just makes it a lived experience and commitment, as well as your point about just the what I would call the spiritual imagination, like letting us have a hopeful imagination for the future that's not in denial of the reality of our broken world, and yet continues to ask the Spirit collectively to give us a sense of where we could be headed if we actually are pursuing that work of reconciliation and of justice and of healing, all those things. Kind of the last thing I want to ask along those lines is around the concept of repentance. And remember in relatively recent years praying the Lord's Prayer and just kind of thinking about for the first time what it means to pray, forgive us our trespasses. Or forgive us our debts. So yes, I'm certainly praying for the personal sins that I've committed, but like Jesus is instructing us to pray for forgiveness for our collective debts and trespasses. And so there's a way in which other people who are kind of praying the same things are praying with me on behalf of in the places where I am guilty and have sinned, and vice versa. And I'm just thinking about, in a couple of weeks, we'll head into the season of Lent, this time of preparation for Easter, where a lot of, churches might be thinking about repentance, and individuals might be thinking about what they're going to give up or, what they're going to do personally to observe Lent. But I'm thinking about this idea of like communal and collective repentance. Like, what might that look like? And also, what might it lead towards?
That's great. Yeah, one of the things that would just help us to there's a book called Misreading the Scriptures Through Western Eyes, and then Misreading the Scriptures Through Individualistic Eyes. And it's just so important to understand that the Bible was written in an honor-shame culture, which means it was like a collective identity culture. Yeah. Like it was in the space that so much of think about the Psalms. A lot of times we read the Psalms in a very individualistic way. And yes, like David may have had some experiences that he wrote, but that was the song book. That was like the hymnal of the nation of Israel. This is all like a communal practice of which the good, bad, and the ugly of the Psalms was all in there in a communal context. So many of the yous that Paul has in the New Testament are really the Southern translation of y'all. Amen. And then when he's really upset with them, all y'all, and so it's really important to understand that when the disciples say, teach us to pray, this is in a context of Jewish people who would go to the temple for fixed hour prayers, and had this concept of this communal identity of being Jewish people, a minority ethnic group, but also minority religious group in the middle of the empire. Yeah. Trying to say hey, how do we be faithful in the midst of this empire? How do we be strangers in a foreign land? Even though this is the land that we're here, but this land is being occupied. And how do we be faithful as a community? Mm-hmm. But then they're also dealing with the consequences of being unfaithful as a community. Rome wouldn't have been there if they were faithful as a community. And I think that's as we go into Lent and as we think about these things in our country, there's been a lot of unfaithfulness that has created this mess that we're in. Mm-hmm. And so we could say Lord, forgive our trespasses, as the people of God here in America. Yeah. Not only for yesterday, but also for the things that are happening today. I mean, it's not it's not as bad as it was yesterday, but there's still some messed up stuff going on today.
A whole lot. Yeah.
And we can say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And we can easily see the way that people trespass against us and how those people over there are doing something to us. But can we see how we and our people are doing things to those people over there?
Yeah. Well, I have one final question for you, and this is just more along the lines of that spiritual imagination, culture change, cultivating towards a vision of a reconciling world, really. And I'm curious, having been in this work now for, over a decade and seeing and working with so many different communities, whether there have been times where you really have seen communities experience, I don't know if transformation is quite the right word in the sense that I know you don't go from, black to white, like from white to black, from, it's not just an immediate or even an entire change. But have you seen communities where you're like, yes, like the work of becoming a reconciling community is transforming who these people are and what their community looks like?
Yeah, I think about, this last fall, there was a church that we were working with up in Chicago, and their church plant, Presbyterian church that recently particularized, and so I guess they aren't a church plant anymore. But they really were working to work against both race and class, and to be a reconciling community as a church. Of course, it's really hard work. Somebody invited an organization that does diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI work, and so they came in and like those were tools that were like, I think my comment about diversity, equity, and inclusion work is partial like work, like it's not how do I say it? Like, I think diversity, equity, inclusion should be fruit of kingdom work. Mm-hmm. And because Christians haven't been engaging in this type of kingdom work, then secular society has to try to figure out how to get kingdom results with the tools that they have.
Yeah.
So I'm very hesitant in critiquing it because I'm not mad at those folks.
Right.
I'm just like, the church has to show up and kind of do what we have to do. But then I'm also like, there's kingdom resources. There's a richness of resources of how to get shalom in the scriptures that we can kind of like, we could model if we would live into it. But long story short, they used those tools and they kind of blew up a lot of stuff at their church, caused a lot of harm to both. A lot of white folks reacted to certain ways and they felt kind of beat up. And then the people of color in that community were like upset that they couldn't see past some of the like shortcomings, but get at some of the like principles that would happen. So they were hurt by the way that the white folks reacted, and it was just hurt all around. And we met up with them and that particular church, and they reached out to us, and they started to go through our processes, as a leadership team. And it was really great because they began to get eyes to see like around them, and they started to partner with a church that was like literally down the street of a different denomination, different ethnic group. They're Presbyterian. I think this is like a charismatic type of Pentecostal church of some sort. They started doing like Advent dinners together, and looked at other kind of ways they can engage together. There was the worship team. There was a situation where you had the two black folks that grew up in like a Pentecostal context and would knew how to like do music through the ear, and there was another person that was like highly degreed organist that they were saying the same thing but using different language, and then they were able to say, and they were getting kind of frustrated and irritated just trying to work together in this deadline. And then somebody like kicked on the Arrabon training and said, "Oh, we're talking past one another. We need to exercise some cultural intelligence. When you say this word, do you mean this? And when you say that word, do you mean that?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, we just did." And they were able to kind of like have a reconciling moment, like in that particular space. And the pastor now feels more empowered to lead the congregation in a way that's more kingdom oriented. And so, it's just really great to see, like, in Chicago, there's a Christian witness of a folks like endeavoring to be a reconciling community. We got plenty of stories, but like I'm just so happy that it's just one of many that we can share.
Well, and I love that too, because it is, yes, about the leadership, but also just that very, almost mundane example of like, we're trying to make music together and we're coming at it from different backgrounds. And so we're just kind of bumping up against each other and elbowing each other until someone says, hold on, we know how to do this. And it doesn't have to be like this. I love that. And I hope that people listening to this podcast will say, I think we might need some of those tools and resources because I know that Arrabon has, seen kind of explosive growth in the past couple of years. And yet, which on some level was this kind of reactionary growth, right? All these churches who, in the wake of George Floyd, were like, oh no, we really do need to respond. And yet what you're offering is not more reactivity, but actually that longer, broader work. But as you said, there's a lot in our secular culture right now that is true and good as far as it can go when it comes to some of the DEI work. And yet there is this deeper spiritual realm of possibility, I think, for healing, that those of us who are in a position of having a common faith in a God of love and healing and of sacrificial service and of resurrection hope, like there's so much more that's available to us if we will actually go to that place together of learning and of repentance and of reconciling with one another and of really trusting that the Spirit will actually bring something good and fruitful, again, back to your cultivation image of, whether it's a tree that grows or a plant that blooms or whatever. I believe that will happen through the work you're doing. And it's fun to get to learn from it and see it. And yeah, we're just really grateful for all that you do.
Thank you so much, my sister. Appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Thanks for the encouraging words.
Anytime. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
As always, thank you for listening to this episode of Love is Stronger Than Fear. I will say again, the Arrabon website is a great place for more information and even just more thought-provoking material. So that's Arrabon, ARRABON.com. And again, it'll be in the show notes. And I will mention one more time that we do have resources for Lent on my website, amyjuliabecker.com/resources. As you know, the way we find out about podcasts is because people say, hey, you've got to listen to this. So if this conversation was meaningful to you, if it was helpful to you, would you please just think of a friend or two that you'd like to share it with? You also can, of course, just go over to the podcast and give it a rating or a review. And you can give me feedback. I'd love to hear from you, whether it's just to say that it was a helpful episode or to suggest other guests or topics that you'd like to see us cover here. I'm also always really thankful for Jake Hansen, who edits this podcast, and for Amber Beery, my social media coordinator. They make everything happen behind the scenes, and I am really grateful for that. Finally, as you go into your day today, I hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.